The story begins by introducing us to a prison known as the White Hell. Our protagonist, Chorny, walks with his hands shackled under the watchful eyes of dozens of guards, heading toward the site of his execution. The leader of the group, an old man with scars and gray hair, appears and removes the hood from our protagonist, calling him an impure element and a serious threat to their glorious cause. He orders that Chorny be executed by hanging. The protagonist, gagged, listens as the old man praises his skills, which could have wiped them out single-handedly, and that he deserved respect for it. However, because of those abilities, he would be killed. The old man then asks if the protagonist has any last words, and a guard removes the gag from his mouth. He spits and tells the old man that there is nowhere to hide. The old man laughs and acknowledges that he makes sense, remarking that all the torture he endured must have shattered his spirit. The old man then orders the execution to proceed. The trapdoor opens, and the protagonist falls. One of the guards notices something is wrong and shouts to alert the leader, while the protagonist, with a knife, tries to cut the rope, leaving the old man in shock. Suddenly, the soldier behind the old man is shot and falls. Then, one of the soldiers removes his mask, revealing himself to be a spy. The protagonist manages to cut the rope while other soldiers also reveal themselves as spies and begin attacking the guards. One of the spies throws a weapon to the protagonist, who catches it midair. He then starts spinning and shooting, hitting all the guards. At this moment, the old man tries to escape with two soldiers, but they are quickly stopped by two spies. The old man wonders if this is a rebellion and who these people are, while our protagonist continues eliminating more guards. The protagonist then picks up an earpiece and puts it on while walking towards the old man. He points the weapon at the old man's head, who screams in desperation. The protagonist fires while speaking on the phone, saying the target has been eliminated. He then puts on a gas mask as gas quickly spreads throughout the facility. We are then introduced to the protagonist's allies, Liam from Germany, Chris from the United States, Temuera from New Zealand, and Eiji from Japan. They are members of an international anti-terrorism agency, Task Force 55, and they are the top 5 operational agents in the world. The protagonist then asks Eiji to check if everyone is dead. The protagonist then makes contact through the earpiece, and soon after, we see the base explode. We are then revealed the true name of the protagonist, Lee Shin-hyuk, a South Korean and leader of Task Force 55. After the mission is over, the protagonist is back at the presidential office, an underground bunker in South Korea. An agent applauds him and asks how it felt to be on death row. He replies that it was nothing special and asks why the sudden concern, when the director of the Planning and Coordination Office, Choi Ik-soo, appears and announces that the VIPs will be arriving soon and that they should save the conversation for later. The president enters the room and asks the protagonist to approach. In recognition of his achievements and dedication to the work, he awards him the title of Vantablak, which means being a master at eliminating targets. From that moment on, he will receive high-level security missions, with his first task being to serve as the president's special bodyguard in the shadows. The president then greets him, adjusts his suit, and says that his life is now in his hands. The protagonist then greets him back and says that he will protect him at all costs. Later, while walking through the streets, the protagonist receives a call and answers excitedly. It's his sister, Suman, congratulating him on his promotion at work. He then says they would talk more at home, but Suman replies that she is at the airport. She tells him that they finally allowed her to make her debut and that she's excited to be a backup dancer for K1, a famous singer. He asks if she is really famous, and she is shocked, asking how he could not know her, saying that she is the queen of K-pop, UK1. She says that she will soon be K1's successor. He smiles and says it's a shame he can't see her now, but if it makes her happy, he'd be happy too. Suman cries, saying that he is her only family, and after years of being drowned in work, she can finally see him, but now they would have to part again. However, she says that when they reunite, she will cook something delicious for him. He thanks her and asks her to stay in frequent contact. They say "I love you" and end the call. Shortly after, we see that this was the last conversation they had, as something happened to his sister. The protagonist is sitting in a depressed state, drowning himself in alcohol, when Choi Ik-soo appears and asks if he has any idea what he's doing. The protagonist, in a sarcastic tone, says that the agency must be doing well if they have time to care about a retiree like him and adds that he doesn't care anymore and no longer belongs to this nation. The man then shouts, asking if he has any idea that the Vantablak are considered living weapons, and that this case, even involving a celebrity like UK1, is being largely hidden by the media. The protagonist then says that all he has managed to uncover so far is a name, Bluff, with an unknown identity, and that this name is linked to a drug cartel operating in Central and South America, though neither the identity nor any witnesses have ever been found. The man then says that the tragic death of his sister is in the past, but that it happened in Brazil, and no one knows that place better than he does. He warns that if the protagonist continues digging on his own, the agency will have no choice but to eliminate him. The protagonist suddenly leaps toward Choi with a chopstick, pressing it against the man's throat, and dares him to try. The man asks what he thinks he would achieve by killing him now. The protagonist turns away and orders him to stay out of his business. Choi then says that trying to talk to him was a mistake, that he warned him, and walks away. The protagonist then notices a piece of paper on the floor and wonders if it belongs to Choi. He picks it up and realizes it is from the agency responsible for K1's and his sister's security. 1 year later, we see a crowd chanting the name of an idol, Choi Si-yeon, when suddenly one of her bodyguards notices a suspicious hooded man. The man, holding a knife, runs toward Choi Si-yeon, shoving her bodyguard aside, trying to reach her while shouting how much he loves her. One of her bodyguards reacts, grabbing the man by his hood and throwing him to the ground with a judo move, something that likely left the guy paralyzed. Don't try this at home. Afterward, the bodyguard immobilizes the man on the ground, revealing him to be Lee Shin-hyuk, our protagonist. Holding the man down, he tells him not to move or he'll get hurt, though it seems too late for that. A bystander streams the incident live, showing the damage caused by the bodyguard. The man cries on camera, claiming he's just a fan who wanted to give Choi Si-yeon a gift. Our protagonist is now at the Defender's Security Agency, speaking with the company's CEO, Baek Jun-wook, about the repercussions of his actions. The CEO sarcastically asks if he's trying to bankrupt the company, questioning if what happened last year in South America wasn't enough and why he's causing another scene. The protagonist calmly explains he was just following the emergency manual. The CEO, furious, asks what kind of manual instructs throwing fans to the ground. The protagonist clarifies that the man was armed, but the CEO becomes even angrier, shouting that it was just a pen the man wanted to give as a gift to Choi Si-yeon. He asks if the protagonist will take responsibility for the flood of complaints the agency is receiving because of a damn manual. With a serious and composed expression, the protagonist replies that he would act the same way if the situation repeated. The CEO, now boiling with rage, asks if the protagonist is trying to make a fool of him and says he only hired him on someone else's recommendation. They're interrupted by the secretary, who announces the arrival of the director of Sitri Entertainment for a meeting. Ji Junyuk enters the room, and the previously furious CEO starts flattering him. Ji Junyuk asks if he's interrupting an important meeting, to which the CEO replies it's just a small conversation and orders the protagonist to leave. As the protagonist stands up, Ji Junyuk asks if he's the bodyguard who recently became famous for acting violently. Excited, he says he's been wanting to meet him. He explains that due to the incidents during the last tour in Latin America, he wants the protagonist to be in charge of Yu Chai-won's security, saying it's a special request from her. The CEO objects, saying it's impossible because Lee Shin-hyuk's contract was terminated due to excessive use of force. Suddenly, Yu Chai-won enters the room, shocking everyone. She says she heard the bodyguard was there, and her agent explains he just found out his contract was terminated. She says it's perfect since now she can hire him directly without going through the agency. She explains that the man he stopped had been stalking Si-yeon and her for years and that, if not for him, someone could have been hurt. She insists she needs someone who prioritizes her safety above all else and protects her no matter the situation. The protagonist listens silently as Yu Chai-won declares she doesn't want to go to South America after what happened. She says that if she's forced to go, she should at least be allowed to choose her own bodyguard. The CEO protests, but Yu Chai-won, with a dark expression, says she won't go without him and asks him to consider the impact of her not attending. The CEO reluctantly agrees, and the protagonist's contract is renewed. As Yu Chai-won leaves, she tells him she'll see him again in Brazil. Hours later, the protagonist is walking down an alley, checking his phone, where he sees a message from his boss thanking him and calling him the team's treasure. He sighs and continues walking when someone starts following him. The person tries to approach him, but the protagonist turns and grabs the man's arm, throwing him to the ground. The man asks how he dares use such a technique on a civilian. The protagonist replies that no ordinary person would follow someone while making so much noise. Later, the two are eating together at a restaurant. The man asks about his work, saying it was difficult to get him placed there. The protagonist thanks him, and the man jokes about how amazing he looked in the viral video, suggesting he could become more famous than the celebrities he protects. The man asks about his plans for the next week and invites him to a judo gym. The protagonist interrupts, saying he's planning to go to Rio de Janeiro. Shocked, the man asks what he intends to do in Brazil. The protagonist replies he has a job scheduled there. The man asks if he's okay with going to Brazil, and the protagonist says he's become numb to it all. The man expresses relief but warns him to be careful, as the atmosphere in South America is becoming more unstable and the agency is still keeping an eye on him. He adds that this is what it means to be Vantablack. Later, the protagonist arrives home, looks at a photo of his sister, and starts thinking about the world's largest criminal cartel, Shika, which developed a new type of drug undetectable by current technology. He recalls their close ties with most countries and the mysterious figure believed to be the cartel's leader, Bluff, who was involved in the incident that killed his sister. The protagonist says he's waited a long time, and by being Yu Chai-won's bodyguard, he'll get close to the bastard who killed his sister. He promises to chase him to the ends of the earth and tear him apart. Lee Shin-hyuk then arrives in Brazil. We see him and Yu Chai-won arriving at a hotel. As they walk, Chai-won asks if this is his first time on such a distant mission. He replies it's his first time protecting an artist so far from home. She tells him to relax and just follow her lead. They enter a luxurious hall where a Brazilian senator is impressed to see her. An Argentine diplomat greets her, and another man mentions his daughter is a big fan. Suddenly, a man approaches Chai-won, saying he'd like to have her. The protagonist is shocked when the man introduces himself as Bluff and wonders if Chai-won is truly the key. He thinks it's all too easy but doesn't care about anything else and just wants to kill him with his own hands. However, before he can act, the man is shot and falls dead. Armed men storm the hall, firing shots and ordering everyone to stay still. The senator wonders where the bodyguards are and why this country can't have a single day of peace. The protagonist is initially shocked but quickly regains composure. He grabs an umbrella, opens it to shield Chai-won, hopefully, it's bulletproof, and instructs her to stay calm, assuring her he'll ensure her safety. The protagonist calls for reinforcements as the armed men approach. A bald man demands Chai-won go with them. The protagonist closes the umbrella and assumes a fighting stance. He charges at the man, striking him with the umbrella. He then disarms another attacker, using the umbrella's handle to fling the weapon away, and punches the man, leaving Chai-won stunned, wondering who this man is and how he can remain so calm in such a situation. The protagonist returns to Chai-won, asks if she's okay, and says they need to evacuate immediately. As they flee, he sees the armed men carrying away the body of the man who introduced himself as Bluff. The protagonist wonders if this is a terrorist attack to eliminate Bluff. In the car, Chai-won is shaken, questioning why these things happen to her. The protagonist grabs her arms and reassures her everything will be fine as long as she follows his instructions. He closes the car door and tells the driver to head to the designated location, saying he'll follow shortly. Soon after, motorcycles start chasing the car, firing at it. The driver begins receiving instructions from Lee Shin-hyuk, who tells him to brake sharply on the count of 3, assuring him he'll handle the rest. The driver hesitates but complies, causing the car to skid and the pursuers to crash into it. The protagonist corners the attackers and starts shooting at them, leaving the driver and Chai-won wondering if he's even human. The protagonist announces the threats have been neutralized and orders the driver to proceed to the safe location. Chai-won looks back in disbelief at what he's done. Removing his helmet, the protagonist approaches one of the fallen attackers, staring at him with a chilling expression. The protagonist crouches down and examines the mouth of one of the men, noticing the symbol of Shika. He then turns to a man who is still alive and asks where Bluff is. Placing his gun in the man's mouth, he warns that he will only ask once more. The man sarcastically replies, "In your parents' bed." The protagonist thinks to himself that he won't let him die so easily. The man bites his own tongue, and the protagonist realizes that if he'd rather die than talk, it must mean that Bluff is still alive. Later that night, the protagonist sits in his hotel room, reflecting on the death of the one who claimed to be Bluff. He concludes that it was someone impersonating him and that the terrorist attack was orchestrated to kill the imposter. He deduces this was a warning from Shika to the world. However, it's clear their objective also included kidnapping Yu K-won. Even the imposter knew of her existence. The protagonist knows K-won is one of Shika's targets but doesn't yet understand why. Suddenly, Yu K-won knocks on his door. The protagonist opens it and asks what's going on. She tells him that after his near-death experience, he deserves a drink. He looks at her silently, and she teases him, saying he's too cold for wanting to stay sober after everything he's been through. She adds that drinking with her, a K-idol, is his reward for saving her life. She starts drinking and asks why he is always so serious. She thanks him for saving her, and he responds that she reminds him of someone. Shocked, she asks if that person looked like her. He says she knows who it is. Sleepily, she picks up her phone and begins to think about who it could be. She falls asleep, dropping her phone. The protagonist picks it up, watches her sleeping, and thinks about how much she resembles his sister. He realizes she is the reason for the earlier attack and decides to continue using her as bait. Hours later, K1's phone rings. She wakes up startled and sees it's her manager calling. She answers, and he nervously asks if she's okay. She yells, saying this is why she didn't want to return to Brazil. She demands that he abandon everything and send a private jet before she breaks her contract. He asks her to calm down, reminding her that a lot of money is involved, and pleads with her to reconsider. She insists it's a disaster and orders him to cancel all her commitments immediately. Her manager says this has become a national level issue. K1 retorts that it doesn't matter since she'll end up dead anyway. Turning to the protagonist, she asks what he thinks about the situation. The protagonist takes the phone and tells her manager that the terrorists will likely come after K1 again and that staying in Brazil would pose a serious threat. She then decides to return to Korea the next day. The protagonist reflects that even though the Shika cartel is based in Brazil, they operate on a global scale, and once they target someone, they won't stop until they're found. After the call ends, K1's manager turns to another man and says it's no longer possible to keep her in South America. The man, furious, asks if he wants their entertainment company shut down. Panicking, he wonders how he'll explain this to his superiors. The scene shifts to a prison in Rio de Janeiro, showcasing its brutality, with prisoners fighting. Amid the chaos, we see an inmate carving an image of Our Lady. Another man approaches his cell and calls out to him. The inmate places the sculpture alongside others and asks him to speak. The man reports that, as instructed, they eliminated the imposter tarnishing his name but failed to capture UK1. The muscular, Jesus-like man asks if they failed. The man says another team has been sent and promises they'll capture her within 12 hours. The Jesus-like man stands and says UK1 has already returned to Korea and that another branch of the faction will handle it from now on. The man kneels, begging him to reconsider, but before he can finish, the Jesus-like man approaches the bars and stabs him in the nose. The man pleads for another chance but is killed. Bluff then leaves his cell and orders another cartel member to bring UK1 within 2 weeks. The new man assigned to capture K1 looks at a photo of her and notices Lee Shin-hyuk in it. He declares that he'll handle it. A week later, back in Korea, K1 is at a recording studio trying Korean street food. Her manager remarks on the heat and suggests she have a drink to regain energy. She retorts, asking how much more he wants from her before letting her rest and telling him to focus solely on directing. K1 looks back and sees a figure that seems familiar. She thinks it might be Lee Shin-hyuk. She calls his name, but a bodyguard turns around, and she's disappointed to see it's not him. She texts Shin-hyuk, asking where he is and if he received her schedule. K1 is visibly upset by his absence. The scene shifts to Shika's assassination and kidnapping group. A female member remarks how long it's been since they all gathered, mocking their decline for being tasked with kidnapping a K-idol. Another member asks the leader if her car is nearby. The leader tells them to wait. The bald member says they're being followed. The man with a samurai bun wonders if it's the bodyguard from the photo and how he's already on their trail. The bald man says he's closing in fast. The leader says they should eliminate him first and form a 4-direction encirclement. The others agree, and the bald man notes that he is 30 steps away from them. They split up and take their positions. Their plan is to wait until he enters the range of their 4-direction formation and attack him with poison blades capable of killing with just one touch. Suddenly, the protagonist appears behind the bald man, grabs him by the neck, and points a blade at his throat. He commands him to freeze, warning that if he makes a single sound, he will die. The bald man is left incredulous, wondering who this person could be. The bald man moves his hand to grab his axe but is quickly neutralized by the protagonist. One of the bald man's allies appears from behind and strikes, but the protagonist swiftly turns, using the bald man's body as a human shield. The ally is stunned by his reaction speed and assumes there was a failure in their formation. He decides it's better to step back and regroup. Confident in his speed, he leaps backward, but the protagonist closes the distance in an instant and slashes the man's throat with his blade. The leader witnesses the scene and realizes this man is no ordinary bodyguard. He managed to identify the formation and dismantle the trap. However, the leader remains determined to complete the mission at all costs, believing this is the true meaning of Night Dew. He leaps forward, attempting to stab Shin-hyuk in the back. Shin-hyuk quickly turns and stabs the leader in the chest. In disbelief, the leader wonders how Night Dew could be defeated so easily. The protagonist replies that the basics of assassination involve hiding in the shadow of your opponent. The leader falls to his knees, dead, as the protagonist looks up at the hole in the ceiling, where the last of the kidnappers is hiding. She hides, wondering where a monster like him could have come from. She knows she must escape and report everything to her superior. She runs, but the protagonist, like a character in a horror movie, seems to teleport, appearing to scare her. He tells her she has two choices: reveal who she is taking orders from or join her fallen companions. She asks if he's joking and if he really thinks she'll comply. She swallows some poison pills, collapses, and dies. The protagonist checks her lips, confirming that she was a member of Shika. He reflects that, as suspected, Shika had already reached Korea. Shortly after, we see K1's manager congratulating her on a job well done. She remains silent as he leaves. K1 picks up her phone, frustrated by Shin Hyuk's lack of answers. Suddenly, the door of her car opens. It's the protagonist. She asks where he's been all this time and why he suddenly appeared without any explanation. He replies that he was taking care of his business. Irritated, she asks what tasks could have kept him away for a week. He interrupts her, handing her an envelope, and says that if she wants to live, she must listen to him. She wonders why he should even bother listening to him and throws the envelope to the ground with frustration. The envelope lands with a soft thud, and the photos inside scatter across the floor, drawing K1's attention. She quickly rushes to gather them up, her eyes scanning the images before she looks up at him and asks what they are. The protagonist takes a deep breath before explaining that ever since they returned to Korea, these people have been relentlessly trying to get close to her, and it's only a matter of time before they make their move. K1's expression shifts to one of pure concern, and she asks, her voice trembling slightly, who these people are. The protagonist, with a serious tone, explains that they are members of a criminal syndicate known as Shika, and although their base of operations is in South America, they are a global network involved in illicit activities. He warns her that they are far more dangerous than she could imagine. K1, still in shock, grabs her phone and immediately suggests they call the police. But before she can dial, the protagonist swiftly takes the phone from her hand and shakes his head. He tells her that they have influence not only within the Korean police but also with high-ranking officials around the world, making it impossible for them to rely on the authorities for help. She stares at him in disbelief, unable to fathom what he's saying, and asks who Shin Hyuk really is. The protagonist's eyes darken as he explains that his sole mission is to dismantle Shika, and he only agreed to become her bodyguard in order to get closer to them. He goes on to reveal that he meticulously planned everything, even going so far as to capture the man who had been stalking her on the subway, using him as a means to get her attention. K1's face hardens as she asks if he had been using her from the very beginning. The protagonist looks at her steadily and replies that it was an agreement. He would use her to locate Shika, and in return, she would use him to protect her life. K1 turns her face away in frustration, saying that he openly used her as bait and now expects her to trust him. The protagonist, undeterred, calmly states that she has no other choice now. No matter where she hides, they will come after her, relentlessly, until they find her. Visibly upset, K1 says that it has never been easy for her and orders him to leave. She feels betrayed and conflicted, but she knows there's no turning back now. The scene then shifts to a different setting, where K1 is rehearsing for what would be her concert. She practices her choreography with intense focus when her manager suddenly appears, telling her that they need to have a serious conversation. K1 turns around, and we see that she has hired several new bodyguards. The manager, clearly taken aback, asks her what all of this is about. K1 responds coldly, saying that she should be the one asking. What is so important that the company felt the need to hire all these bodyguards without consulting her first? The manager is left speechless, unsure of how to respond. K1 turns her attention back to her training, but her mind races with thoughts of what Shin Hyuk had told her. She begins to think that, regardless of whether what he said was true or not, this situation was far beyond what just one or two bodyguards could handle. She feels a growing sense of unease in her chest. Suddenly, dozens of men with blades appear, and one of the bodyguards immediately steps forward, telling them that entry is not allowed. But before he can finish his sentence, a man strikes him with an axe, landing a brutal blow to his shoulder. We are then introduced to Bonkar, a member of Shika's East Asia division, the Mongolian contract group. K1 hears the guard's painful scream as the men rush into the auditorium, heading straight toward her. A man dressed in blue charges at one of the bodyguards, stabbing him viciously. The crowd around them erupts into chaos, with people screaming and running for their lives. K1 stands frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. She remembers the chilling words Shin Hyuk had spoken. They would chase her to the ends of the earth. One of the bodyguards manages to stop the attackers from getting too close to her, using his baton to fend them off. As he fights, he reflects on how these men aren't afraid to act, even in broad daylight, in a public place. One of the attackers attempts to strike the bodyguard from behind with an axe, but he manages to block the blow while calling for reinforcements and ensuring a safe escape route for K1. As he grapples with the man, something catches his attention. It's Yama, Bonkar's executive, holding a decapitated head. Yama throws the head toward them, revealing it as the 2,500th head they've collected in their gruesome campaign. Furious, the bodyguard charges toward them, determined to stop them, but the man in the orange shirt effortlessly cuts his baton in half. With one swift strike, he slashes the bodyguard's neck, killing him instantly. The bald man then calls out to K1, his voice filled with menace. She watches in horror as the violence unfolds around her, and she whispers to herself that these people have died because of her. In a moment of courage, K1 orders everyone to stay behind her, attempting to protect them. Just as she does, the man in the blue shirt grabs her wrist, commenting on how soft her skin feels. In a flash of desperation, she punches him in the face with her microphone. The man begins to bleed from his forehead, but to her surprise, he seems unfazed by the pain. He turns to his superior and asks if he can check the package before the delivery. The boss, with a cruel smile, tells him not to dirty it or break it. He then turns to K1, his eyes glinting with malice, and says that she is exactly his type. K1 begins to panic, her heart racing as she calls for help, but before anyone can respond, the man is suddenly stabbed in the neck and falls to the ground, leaving everyone in shock. The teddy bear takes a battle-ready stance, and all the remaining men charge toward him. But in one fluid motion, he slices through them all with deadly precision. He removes his mask, and to the shock of exactly no one, it's our protagonist, Lee Shin-hyuk. He looks at K1 and calmly says, "You should have listened to me." K1, her voice trembling, asks how he got there. The protagonist stares at her for a moment before responding with a question of his own. "Do you now realize what kind of monsters you were dealing with?" She tries to say something, but no words come out. Her face goes pale, the weight of the situation sinking in, leaving her utterly speechless. Heinekar, witnessing the scene, erupts in rage. His voice booms as he demands to know how this bastard could have killed his brothers so easily and without remorse. His face twists with fury, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turn white. Next to him, the bald man begins to cry, his voice breaking as he accuses the protagonist. "How dare you? They were just kids. You killed the youngest. I'll tear you apart." Without hesitation, the two charge at the protagonist together. Their movements are filled with anger and desperation, but it's no use. The protagonist moves with precision and ease, dispatching them effortlessly. His strikes are calculated, his demeanor cold, as if he were dealing with nothing more than insects. The brutality of the encounter is undeniable, and the silence that follows is deafening. At the entrance to the auditorium, On Sang-chul, the head of Shika in Korea, stands watching. His expression is unreadable, but his thoughts are racing. So, this is the man who eliminated Yarrow. And now Heinekar as well. It seems I have no choice. I'll have to handle this myself. Outside the building, a tense scene unfolds. Several black cars are parked in formation, their presence ominous. From the largest vehicle, Higashi Kyokuro, the head of Shika's East Asia division, steps out. His movements are calm, deliberate, as he adjusts his coat and surveys the area. "Where is On Sang-chul?" he asks his subordinates. When no immediate answer comes, his expression hardens, and he begins walking toward the auditorium without waiting for a reply. Inside, Higashi is greeted by a grim sight. On Sang-chul lies battered and broken, his body a testament to the battle he has lost. Barely able to speak, he mutters, "We failed." But before he can say anything more, the protagonist grabs him by the hair, lifts him effortlessly, and, with a swift and decisive slash, cuts his throat. The room falls silent. The men around them are frozen in shock, but one finally breaks the quiet, shouting in panic, "On Sang-chul has been defeated. We need to prepare for a full-scale attack." Higashi, still standing near the entrance, raises a hand to silence him. His voice is calm but carries a weight that demands obedience. "Enough. I'll handle this myself." With that, he removes his coat, revealing the traditional combat attire beneath, and steps forward. The protagonist, unfazed, turns to UK1. His voice is steady as he tells her, "Go backstage. This won't take long." She hesitates for a moment, concern evident in her eyes, but eventually nods and retreats as instructed. Higashi approaches slowly, his gaze fixed on the protagonist. "You're good, Shin-hyuk. On Sang-chul was one of Korea's most exceptional talents, but even he fell to you. Impressive. But this ends here. No one defies my father's orders." The protagonist's eyes narrow as he processes the statement. Could this father he speaks of be bluff? Higashi stops a few feet away, his presence imposing. "You should feel honored to die here, by my hand," he declares. The protagonist takes a deep breath, analyzing the situation. The katana in Higashi's hand gives him a significant range advantage over the protagonist's knife. Closing the distance will be nearly impossible without exposing himself. Higashi strikes first. His katana slices through the air in a powerful, direct frontal slash. The protagonist dodges by a hair's breadth, feeling the wind of the blade pass dangerously close. A few strands of his hair are severed, falling gently to the floor. As he steps back, the protagonist reflects on Higashi's reputation. This man is no ordinary opponent. He's the leader of Sheikah's East Asia division, representing Korea, China, and Japan. Years ago, there was a massive civil war among candidates vying for this position, and Higashi was the one who ended it single-handedly. Higashi, known in the Yakuza as the Demon Serpent, doesn't let up. He presses forward, his katana a blur as he unleashes a series of relentless strikes. The protagonist dodges each one, but the sheer speed and precision of the attacks leave him little room to counter. One strike lands, grazing his chest. The pain is sharp, but the protagonist remains calm, assessing the wound. Just a superficial cut, he reassures himself. He's fast, the protagonist thinks. Every attack is compact and precise. This level of mastery is only achievable by someone who has completely perfected their swordsmanship. It's as if he has multiple arms, leaving no openings to exploit. Realizing he can't approach Higashi directly, the protagonist scans the room for an alternative. His eyes fall on a baton lying on the floor. Quickly, he grabs it and assumes a defensive stance. Higashi watches, intrigued. "What's your plan now?" he asks, his tone mocking. Without waiting for an answer, he charges again. The protagonist blocks and parries, the baton clashing against the katana. He studies Higashi's movements carefully, looking for any sign of an opening. Finally, he sees it. With a precise strike, he smashes the side of Higashi's katana, throwing the swordsman off balance. Higashi retaliates with another slash, but the protagonist counters, striking the katana again. This time, the blade snaps. Higashi stares at his broken weapon in disbelief. "You were reading my blade's trajectory the entire time?" Before he can react further, the protagonist grabs him and throws him across the room. Higashi hits the ground hard and loses consciousness. The remaining men, stunned by what they've just witnessed, begin to panic. One shouts, "Kill him now!" They charge at the protagonist, but as they get closer, they're overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of his aura. His terrifying gaze freezes them in place. Without hesitation, the protagonist advances, cutting through them with brutal efficiency. When the dust settles, he stands alone, walking over the bodies toward Higashi. He notices a tattoo on Higashi's back and grimaces. "Disgusting." Pulling out his phone, he's interrupted by K1's voice calling his name. He turns to her, his face and hands covered in blood. Her eyes widen in shock as she takes in the sight. If you've watched till the end,